gone. He's just visiting. And by the way, he came to the Gulf of Mexico every year after that first year in 1904 until he died, with the exception of 1 year which he had a stroke. And he couldn't travel that one particular winter. But why would I open up with Winslow Homer then instead of a Gulf siding? That's exactly right. To establish that connection right up front. To drive home the idea to my readers that the Gulf of Mexico has these connections to all of America. And that it's not just this regional sea, that it is an American sea. And there are connections like that throughout the book. There are connections with a lot of other New Englanders throughout the book as well. Let me give you an example. I wanted my readers to know that all Americans are historically and ecologically connected to the Gulf of Mexico. So let me talk about more New England connections, but also an ecological connection as an example. So the Gulf of Mexico today is one of the most productive commercial fisheries in the United States. It outperforms the entire east coast of the U.S., unless we have an oil spill, as a commercial fishery. An over $20 billion a year industry for the 5 U.S. Gulf states. Really remarkable. And so, when you think about it, the Spanish were on the Gulf of Mexico for some 300 years. They never developed a commercial seafood industry. The British were here for a short period. The French were here as well. None of them developed a commercial fishing industry. That was left up to enterprising Americans. And Americans start getting into the commercial fishing business soon after, right after Andy Jackson came down and grabbed the Floridas from the Spanish. New England fishermen came down here in the wintertime. They are our original snowbirds. They came down here in the wintertime, beginning in the early 19th century, because they had fished out many of their cod grounds up north. And they came down here to fish for the season, and many of them returned and went north as the weather began to warm up. Many of them stayed here and promoted the seafood industry in the Gulf of Mexico and established seaport towns such as Destin, Florida, or fishing towns such as Destin, Florida. Leonard Destin was from Connecticut, came down in 1835. But you could go to any one of these fishing villages and fishing ports around the Gulf of Mexico in the mid to late 19th century, and you would find New Englanders in places like Apalachicola, in Mobile, Alabama, in Tampa, Florida. If you went to Pensacola, which was probably the busiest commercial fishing port in the late 19th century on the Gulf of Mexico. If you went to Pensacola in the 1880s, the names you would see on the side of the fish houses were all New Englander names. Anybody here from Pensacola? Right next door. Okay. Well, what's Pensacola proud of today? What does it remember as far as its heritage? It's Confederate heritage, very much so. It's Spanish heritage. Pensacola was the capital of Spanish West Florida. But they know nothing. In fact, you can go today, they have Civil War reenactments in Pensacola. This is one thing I love about Pensacola. They have 2 days of Civil War reenactments. The first day, they tell the truth and let the Yankees win. Nobody comes to those events. The next day they tell a lie and say the Confederates won, and everybody comes. But if you told them that, hey, you have a distinguished New England heritage, they're clueless. They have no idea. And by the way, Pensacola is a wonderful place. I really like it. Downtown Pensacola is really developed because they got smart about cleaning up their water there. And it got a big surprise when downtown Pensacola sprang to life. Much like downtown Sarasota has in the past couple of decades, and St. Pete. Not on the same scale, but significantly. But in any case, so Pensacola was really the seafood capital of the Gulf of Mexico in the late 19th century. And so it was Americans who launched the very productive commercial fishing industry. The Gulf of Mexico is not only one of the most productive commercial fishing areas in the United States, it's also the most popular saltwater fishing hole in the United States. The most popular, generating over $5 billion in revenue every year. And so why? Why is it so successful commercially and recreationally? Because of the, as the scientists would say, the biomass. Or as the poets would say, Wallace Stevens said, that's because the Gulf of Mexico is a fishy sea, which is an expression I love. Yes, it's one of the richest estuarine environments in the world, the Gulf of Mexico. There's some 200 estuaries around the Gulf of Mexico. And those estuaries obviously are responsible for the marine life in the Gulf of Mexico. And what do you need? And not just marine life, the bird life. We wouldn't have the bird life if we didn't have the marine life, right? But what do we need? What's the magic ingredient for that an estuary needs? Freshwater and saltwater mix. Okay, there are some 116 rivers that flow to the Gulf of Mexico, bringing that wonderful fresh water and stimulating those estuaries. The majority of those rivers flow through the 5 U.S. states. 85% of the fresh water that flows to the Gulf of Mexico flows through the 5 U.S. states, which is one thing that makes it an American sea, and why the United States is endowed with the greater estuarine wealth of the Gulf of Mexico. But those rivers, where do they come from? Those rivers drain over 60% of the lower U.S. From western New York to Canadian provinces to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. All that water comes down to the Gulf of Mexico and delivers us this wonderful estuarine environment. But those rivers bring something else. They bring nutrients, not just fresh water, but they bring nutrients from elsewhere, which are vital to estuary. They bring sediment, which is also vital to estuary, particularly mangrove forests and coastal marshes. But also, there's a geographic feature in the Gulf of Mexico that is central to those estuarine environments. All around the Gulf of Mexico, a geographic feature. What is that? What do you see around the Gulf of Mexico? Barrier islands, right? They're all over. Those barrier islands act like a fence. They cordon in the freshwater and the saltwater mix. They protect not only the shoreline, but they protect those estuaries from intense weather. The Gulf of Mexico has the second largest barrier island in the nation, and that's Padre Island in Texas. How many of you guys have been to Texas? To Padre Island, I should say. To the National Seashore, Gulf Island. It's an ethereal place. I highly recommend visiting if you're ever over that way. And if you're not moved by Padre Island, northern Padre Island, the National Seashore area, if you're not moved by it emotionally, check your pulse. Probably not. It's probably not working. So sport fishing. So here's the interesting thing about sport fishing. When we think of Gulf tourism, we think of the beaches, right? But the beaches were not the first tourist attraction in the Gulf of Mexico. It was fishing. One particular fish. And what was that fish? Many of you know. Tarpon. Tarpon, that's exactly right. In 1885, a New York architect by the name of William Halsey Wood hooked the first tarpon on record in 1885 down by Sanibel in a place called Tarpon Bay now. And when he did that, 1885, there aren't but 300,000 people living in Florida at the time. And not very many people down this far in Florida. But when he hooked that first tarpon, it set the sport fishing community on fire. People from New England, from the Midwest, from the British Isles, converged on the Gulf of Mexico, the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, because everybody wanted to catch a tarpon. They knew if you could catch a tarpon, it would be this wonderful fighting fish. They knew that because before they hooked the first one, they harpooned them, and then they'd tie them off to the front of their two-man skiff and have the tarpon tow them around as it's doing these remarkable aerial acrobatics. And so everybody was eager to hook one, to be able to fight the Silver King. And when Wood did, they started catching them. And bringing people, and of course, when you have all these people converging on the Gulf, who else is coming with them? Entrepreneurs. Putting up hotels and inns. It seemed like everywhere around the Gulf there was a tarpon inn. And so they went down primarily to southern Texas and southwest Florida to fish for tarpon. Of course, in Texas, they claimed that their tarpon were bigger. But, this is what I love, Florida held the tarpon record for 7 years in the late 19th century. I've forgotten the size. I think it was a 210-pound tarpon hooked in somewhere in these waters around here, by the way. Nobody knows exactly where, but it was somewhere in these waters that tarpon was caught. And caught by a woman from Kentucky. Women, and let me tell you something. The records, all the records identified her by her husband's name. And his name was, he was a whiskey distiller from Kentucky. Stagg was his last name. I'm trying to think of his first name. George T. Stagg. And I searched everywhere to find her name. And, because I refuse to identify a woman by her husband's name. Yes. I'll give you one quick example. When I was writing the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas book, there was one particular woman who had a profound influence on Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. A major feminist, supported the Equal Rights Amendment back in the 1920s, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas did. Even Marjorie Stoneman Douglas is referring to this woman as Mrs. Robert Seymour. It is driving me crazy. And I'm finding her referenced everywhere as Mrs. Robert Seymour. For years I'm trying to find her name. And my ex-wife said, well, it's now ex-wife, she wasn't then, she said, just make one up. I said I can't, because somebody may, use me as a source. And so finally, I found a couple of documents she had written that were in the New York Public Library. And I went to New York, and I checked out these two documents. The first one, she's identifying herself as Mrs. Robert Seymour. and then finally, in the second one, it was Jessica Seymour. But with Mrs. George T. Stagg, the tarpon fishing champ, I couldn't find her name anywhere. She was the second wife. She would have been listed in the 1890 census, but they were burned. He died sometime in the 1890s, so she's not appearing in any census. I called the George T. Stagg Distillery. I called everywhere up in Kentucky trying to find her name, and unfortunately never found her. So I've really gotten off track here, so I'm going to get back to it. So, sport fishing. But by the turn of the century, in those days, people would come down and they'd fish for 2 weeks, and seriously, they would catch a couple of dozen tarpon. And these fish weighed 100 to 200 pounds. Big tarpons. You can't eat tarpon. They're bonier than mullet, believe it or not. And that somebody could be bonier than a mullet. And you can't eat tarpon. So what did they do with them? They had their picture taken and then they trashed them. And so by the turn of the century, the tarpon aren't biting like they had before. They've become shy. They've overfished already. But by then, people started paying attention to the beaches. All these men and women coming down to the Gulf of Mexico to tarpon fish started noticing the beautiful white beaches in this area. And so by the time the tarpon were no longer fishing, tourism had transitioned, or was transitioning to beach tourism on the Gulf front. Now those beaches, where does our beautiful white quartz sand come from?
Appalachian Mountains.
Appalachian Mountains, that's right. The Appalachian Mountains at one time were as tall as the Himalayan mountains. And over the eons, rain and wind eroded the top of the mountain and washed that quartz sediment down to the Gulf of Mexico, primarily by the Apalachicola River and the Tennessee River, which used to connect to the Gulf of Mexico, and built these beautiful beaches. It was the Appalachian Mountains that built Florida's future tourist industry. Think about it. This one thing I emphasize in this book is the historical agency of nature. Nature, as an environmental historian, I'm interested in how nature shapes the course of human history. And it does in profound ways. Historians typically don't pay attention to that. Environmental historians do, but conventional historians typically don't. So we owe our beautiful white beaches to nature. That tourism is courtesy of nature. So the rivers bring, well, so no, wait a minute. Before I move on away from beaches, we have these beautiful white beaches here, thanks to the Appalachian Mountains. How many of you guys have seen a Louisiana beach? They're butt ugly, aren't they? They're as brown and as hard as this lectern, aren't they?
They're not beaches.
Have you ever, well, Louisianans sometimes settle for less. No insulting them. It's remarkable that they're able to cope with what they do with the oil industry there and everything else. Have you ever seen a plowed field in Iowa? That's a future Louisiana beach. And their sediment comes down from the Midwest, from the Mississippi, and builds the Louisiana coastline. One thing that sediment has built, which is priceless, is 5,500 square miles of coastal marshland. And it's the richest estuarine environment within this very rich estuarine sea called the Gulf of Mexico. How many of you guys have seen a Texas beach? You've been to Padre. The sands are multicolored. You have white sand, not quite as white as this, beige sand, yellow sand, and pink sand. That's because the Brazos, the Colorado rivers, and the Rio Grande drain the lands all the way up to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. So whatever terrain those rivers pass through, they pick up sediment, different minerals, and deliver them to the Gulf of Mexico. So what else do rivers bring down to the Gulf of Mexico, which are not so great for the estuaries? Pollution. That's exactly right. Some of you guys know this. Many of you guys know this. And some of you guys experience it because you grew up in this area. By the late 1960s, we had polluted the bays and the bayous, the sounds around the Gulf of Mexico to such an extent that virtually every single one was ailing, some of them on the verge of death, including Tampa Bay. We had wiped out, because of pollution that's coming down those rivers, we had wiped out 60, 70. In the case of Tampa Bay, 82% of the seagrass beds in these bays around the Gulf of Mexico. Escambia Bay in Pensacola lost 95% of its seagrass beds. In the 1930s, aerial photographs estimated that there were some 76,000 acres of seagrass beds in Tampa Bay in the 1930s. By the end of the 1960s, there was only 14,000. Horrific. And what's causing this? What's behind this? Well, industry is in part behind it, particularly here with the phosphate industry. But what was the one common culprit all around the Gulf was raw sewage. Every municipality around the Gulf of Mexico was dumping raw sewage into the nearshore waters, into their backyards. But it wasn't just the Gulf side municipalities that were doing that. It was municipalities up these rivers. Were not even in Gulf states. For instance, the Escambia River running down to Escambia Bay, the bay that lost 95% of the seagrass beds, there were 8 wastewater treatment plants up in Alabama on the Escambia River, dumping raw sewage into the river running down to the bay. And in my book, you know how I describe, you know how Alabama is above the western panhandle? Well, I describe Alabama as the buttocks on the throne of West Florida. And, you know, in Alabama, that little shoreline, those are the legs hanging over the throne. But what did we do? We passed the 1972, Congress passed, Nixon signed the 1972 Clean Water Act. And everybody pitched in and got their act together. Local volunteers, local, state, and federal officials, and elected office holders, even businesses pitched in and brought these bays back to teeming life. Now, Tampa Bay is not back to 76,000 acres of seagrass beds, but last I understood it's around 45,000, which is quite a comeback. I think it's Sarasota Bay, or Little Sarasota Bay, am I correct? You guys probably know better than I. It's had more than 100% seagrass regrowth. It's been phenomenal. And thanks to, again, groups like yours, among many others, people caring. And what happened, when I was a kid, growing up on Tampa Bay, about the only thing I could catch, I loved to fish, about the only thing, I don't know why, because the only thing I could catch was a croaker. And if I got really lucky, I could catch a speckled trout. And the only birds I saw were gulls and brown pelicans. But now, boy, you can catch everything, all kinds of stuff out in Tampa Bay now. And the bird life is phenomenal. I never saw a wood stork until the 1990s. I never saw a bald eagle. I'm writing a book on the bald eagle now. I never saw a bald eagle in the wild around here until the late 1990s. And now we see bald eagles everywhere. Just don't build a minor league ballpark where one is nesting, Sarasota County, Pastor. And what's our greatest challenge? You guys have talked about it tonight. What's our greatest challenge facing in the 21st century? It's sea level rise and everything that comes with that. Our infrastructure is not prepared for that. And I'm not talking about our roads. I'm talking about our wastewater treatment, our storm water drainage. We have the same sort of storm water drainage systems as they do in Oklahoma, these landlocked states, which means it's a combined system. When they get backed up, and with intense weather, heavy rains, they get backed up, and when they finally start draining again, what do they bring with them? They bring sewage out into those bays and destroy all of your hard work, or a lot of your hard work. And what is our best defense against rising seas and intense weather? It's restoring the living shoreline. As we were, in the 1970s and 80s, groups were replanting seabeds. Now the trend around the Gulf of Mexico, and this is wonderful to see, all around the Gulf of Mexico, is to restore the living shoreline. Why is that so important? Living shoreline being those coastal marshes down in this part of the Gulf of Mexico, mangrove forests, but oyster beds, and it's so wonderful to hear about the shellfish project ahead for this area, and of course seagrass beds. Those are our best defenses against intense seas because they absorb the impact much better than a seawall did. Seawalls, concrete seawalls, contribute to erosion. They don't stop it. But not only are they good buffers against intense weather and rising seas, but they are estuarine environments, right? They are birthplace, nursery, habitat for marine life. So you have a win-win by restoring the living shoreline. It's not just a win-win-win. It's not just a win-win, it's a win-win-win. Because what's the third win? They are fantastic carbon sinks, absorbing carbon out of the air and out of the water. You cannot go wrong. And they contribute to the economy. A healthy estuarine environment is far better for the economy, as you guys, I'm preaching to the choir now, than one that's destroyed. And even one that's destroyed by industry. And so, again, what gives me hope for the future of the Gulf of Mexico. It's all these living shoreline projects. Even Alabama has set aside a sizable portion of its BP money to restore the living shoreline in Alabama. And it's happening everywhere. That gives me hope. The other thing that gives me hope, as I said earlier, is groups like yours. But the other thing that gives me hope, and I'll stop here, is the millennials and the Gen Zs. They recognize the horrible legacy of ecological legacy of ours. And my daughter tells me all the time, "You're the reason why everything's wrong, Daddy." My 14-year-old who never recycles her paper or plastic. And I remind her, you know that's going up, plastic will end up in the ocean. And so that's what gives me hope for the future of the Gulf of Mexico. If Washington may care less, but I think the real power is at the local and the regional level, but also the national awareness. So thank you. I have time for questions? Yeah.
All right, questions? Yes, Linda, just speak loudly.
What happened to that lawsuit in Louisiana that you talk about? I think it's on about 515.
It's still pending.
Just repeat the question.
Yeah. So what happened to the lawsuit in Louisiana regarding the erosion of suing the oil industry for the oil industry? Let me put it. The oil industry has cut 10,000 miles of canals through coastal Louisiana, which is contributing significantly to the erosion of the Louisiana shoreline. Louisiana is losing, it's the only state in the country that's losing land, and it's losing 25, 30 square miles, the size of Manhattan, every year. And that's largely attributable to the oil industry canals. And so John Barry, an author, who wrote this wonderful book and has been an inspiration for me, The River and Flood, he led a lawsuit against the oil companies to prevent them, to require them to restore the natural habitat of those canals. But, you know, Louisiana is really a colony to the oil industry, and so it's like the Apalachicola lawsuit with Georgia and the Army Corps of Engineers. It's been going on for almost 2 decades now, and it's still not resolved. And so this will continue forever too, unfortunately. I wish I had good news.
Peggy?
Do you have any idea how much of the runoff from how much of the runoff that goes into the Gulf comes from agricultural fertilization of agricultural lands?
So the question is, how much of the runoff to the Gulf of Mexico is coming from fertilized agricultural land? Nobody has an exact figure on that, but we do know that more comes from residential lawns. And so my advice is to get rid of your damn St. Augustine grass if you've got it. Any kind of turf grass that doesn't belong in Florida, and replant it with, stop fertilizing, stop watering, replant it with beautiful native plants. My yard in Gainesville has not a single blade of grass. I have coontie, I have saw palmettos, I have all sable palms, and where I don't have grass, I have pine bark, or I don't have any vegetation, I have pine bark. I have people knocking on my door, strangers knocking on my door all the time, wanting to know, who did your yard? We love it. How do you do this? And it's been a huge hit. It's a matter of aesthetic taste, right? And in the birds, the bees, I have birds and bees and butterflies year-round up in Gainesville in my yard. It's fantastic. Another question.
How do you get Florida to stop with the plastics? Every other state charges $5 per bag, and at least has a plan to stop it.
Right.
And I understand there's a new plant here that is actually manufacturing them. and that's a petroleum-based product.
Yeah, oh, yeah,
So, I mean,
so,
we're all,
unfortunately,
The question is
state of
about
Florida,
stopping
yeah, how do we
plastics.
stop plastics? Single-use plastics, what you're referring to. And such as, well, one thing, you go to Lakeland and you give Publix hell. Because look, Floridians built that grocery store. That grocery store is Florida-born and it owes us a lot.